with his cutlass blade that makes incisions, a C-section through history. The messy afterbirth of a colonial nation. High time we delivered a black Caesarean to Australia.
Thank you. Thank you both for this beautiful and necessary section of our presentation, connecting across the generations and bringing it all into our contemporary times, and even reimagining what the future can look like with the ideology, the nanny ideology, the Brian Nancy ideology that we have all inherited and have reclaimed from our ancestors, and inserting that into our everyday experiences, whether it's on a university campus or a grade, K through 12 classroom, or in fellowship like this. So this is a very important aspect of this whole process of reclaiming the ancestors. And now I'd like to shift into a more nuanced discussion of revolutionizing the ancestors. And each of you has 10 minutes. So you can, I'm about to ask you a question and you can respond with more poetry or in conversation, examining and sharing your particular perspective. And I'm going to start with Emily, because your work engages with ancestral memory and Caribbean folklore in particular. How do you see these elements as tools for revolutionizing our connection to the past?
Now I see especially oral folk tales and oral storytelling as a key way of keeping connected to my ancestry, but also passing that down onto my children. And I think for me, my obsession with folklore and oral histories does begin with my grandfather, who in his book Black Shack Alley talks about a storyteller who told him when he was growing up on the plantations for the first time about Africa, and that his ancestors were stolen from Africa. And it was a kind of pivotal moment in his development of Black consciousness and his understanding of his heritage and his understanding of enslavement and colonialism. So it was an awakening. And the storyteller, and it's captured in the film and the book of his life, in the plantations, but the storyteller tells it to him, through the medium of an oral tale. So with the, ekrik, ekrak, it's a call and response, and he has to respond and make sure that he's listening. And so my mother also told me stories when I was younger. I'd always go to bed with a bedtime story, and they would be Anansi stories. They'd be African fables, stories from around the world. And you carry them in your imagination, become a part of your being. And this is why I love books. This is why I love poetry. I think that these words, stories, they're a conduit to empathy, that we will walk in the shoes of others. Those that read live 1,000 lives. Those who don't read live only one. So I have huge faith in the power of storytelling. I'll respond as well with a poem. So this is a poem actually which was inspired by this is a poem, sorry, about Martinique, and it was inspired by my time in Martinique when I returned there last year, and it's going to be in my new collection, Other Wild. When I went to Martinique, there's quite a lot of, you get a bit of a fuss because they think, oh, you're the granddaughter of Joseph Zobel. And even though he may not be known in other parts of the world, he's a sort of big deal over there. And I had this really very powerful moment when I went to a school that was called the Joseph Zobel School, so named after my grandfather. And there is an inscription over the door of the school which says that education is the sort of the fourth key, the key, to unlock the route to your freedom. There's also a bronze statue of my grandfather's head. It's quite weird, outside the school. And I was stood by this bronze statue of my grandfather's head, and a woman who was showing me around pointed across the hill to these fields, this plantation, and she said, "That is the plantation that your grandfather grew up on. So that's the plantation that your family lived on." And I was just such an incredible juxtaposition for me to be sort of standing there with all this celebration of this, great literary figure, but who actually grew up cutting cane just across the valley. And then it really struck me that the bodies of my ancestors are probably still there in those fields, in graves which haven't been properly marked. So I was thinking about Martinique and the beauty of Martinique, but also how the beauty of the island nearly tries to seduce you away from the reality of the ground, the bloodied ground you're standing on, and the bloodied history all around you. So this poem is called Martinique, I Hear. Martinique, I hear lullabies in your name, notes singing between syllables. Island of flowers, mother's birthplace, you roll across my tongue, sweet as the swaying of my grandmother's hips dancing La Biguine. But under the sweetness, I hear the slash of cane-cutting cutlasses wielded by ancestors buried in unmarked graves in your rich red earth. There I stand, mulâtresse, edges of my skirt lifted by warm breezes, next to the bronze of my grandfather, honouring his world of words, looking across your southern undulations at the plantation of his childhood, site of rupture and blood, cutting a trail back to Benin. Around me, hummingbirds seek nectar from deep within the throats of heliconias, and pelicans dive for silver fish on the distant rolls of the ocean. And I wonder how your abundance, a loveliness which nearly hurts the eye, has seen us in chains, how you've spread the roots of l'oiseau de paradis over our rusted manacles. Are you beautiful, Martinique, to distract us from the blood dripping down the pages of our past? Martinique, I hear lullabies in your name, but I must not sleep.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's interesting the way you have braided the past into the present, that present situation, and connect that specifically to the land, to the country, by personifying the country itself, the land, and making that into a tangible, almost human-like
Yes.
being, and the questioning of the role of the country, the land, in the history of Black people.
I think that I was also very deeply affected by having gone on a plantation tour in Martinique, and there being a kind of audio tour, and there was hardly any mention of enslavement. There was just a mention of the fact that a mixed heritage freed person had been able to buy the plantation after slavery and was able to turn it, create rum. So it became a kind of rum distillery. And then you go and taste the rum, and it's all about the rum and the beautiful barrels, and just that whole story obliterated. And Martinique is a frustrating place to be in because it has, it's still very colonized. It hasn't, people's minds have not been decolonized. It's still it's very French, and the benefits of that are economically there's great stability, but there's also a lack of kind of radical
A
Black
lack of
consciousness,
consciousness.
a
So
radical Black
you're
consciousness, yeah, that
yes.
is not there. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm.
So later on, we're going to talk about our own accountability as creatives in disrupting these kinds of mindsets and, creating the path to dismantling them. I've found that at times you have to be disruptive.
Mm.
I've been in situations where on the spur of the moment, I decide that I am going to be disruptive here and now. And I might be thrown out of a conference, for example, and I've been
Go on,
threatened.
Marva.
Yes, but I could not let the moment pass by, with something similar to this as well, where everything is glossed over and it's just, but what is the truth? So we'll talk a little bit about that later on, our responsibility in being subversive and disruptive, and do we have the agency to do that? And can we afford to take the
Yes.
risk? Because it is
Yes.
a risk. And do we
Definitely.
pull back from that because the risk is too strong?
Yeah.
Yes. This poem really lit a kind of fire in my bones, and the way you tapped into memory and carry it forward. It's beautiful. So Andrew, your poetry grapples with identity and memory, and some of my favorite poems. Um, you have not shared those today, but your relationship with your grandmothers and your mother, your connection to Ghana, growing up in Britain, and so on. How do you approach the act of revolutionizing your ancestors through your poetic form? And you do have a particular narrative form that you tend to use to tell the story of your own heritage and ancestry. How how do you approach this act of revolutionizing the ancestors, bringing them alive and sharing through your poetic form and voice?
Okay. Look, I mean, it's sort of using literature as a tool. Now, poetry, I think, is a kind of multi-purpose tool. I started
Yes.
off, I did a history degree, writing kind of, abstract kind of cold essays did not really do it for me. I didn't feel like I was reaching much of an audience. Writing, I've kind of come to that fairly late, probably in the piece, although I was writing things in my head. I was observing things. But I find that, Emily, you were talking about juxtapositions. You're afforded so many juxtapositions when you write poetry, but when you also perform it, which goes with, that revolutionizing, I think, happens in the space of the page, but it happens in the space of performance, which is another kind of juxtaposition, I feel, between the oral storytelling traditions. And I loved listening to stories as a child, and I listened to the stories of Anansi. I also listened to the stories of Rupert Bear, the stories of Danny, the Champion of the World, and Roald Dahl. So storytelling was something that captured me because it was a multi-purpose, dynamic form. So I search for forms that I feel are multi-purpose and dynamic because they serve a purpose in being able to connect with people viscerally, but also connect with them in an academic kind of distanced way as well. So I find that poetry is something I sort of have gravitated to, but it's a kind of blend. And I guess my more recent writing in sort of Haibun is a very flexible form. So I'm interested in, I think, looking at or just being a little bit of a magpie and picking from different places and not being too worried about what they're officially called or what those literary forms are. But really, there's something about poetry and music, and I've spoken about it before, but there's something that really resonates with me in the very widest sense of human evolution. And I am fascinated in how do we develop language, as a kind of species, and where did that bifurcation between music and language, where was that? Because I believe that it is a proto language, and it's something that stirs in us, that comes to our very center of us being human. So I feel that is a kind of tool that we all have within us. So I'm using that, for my own kind of exploration. But also I'm sort of, the revolutionizing part for me is kind of revolutionizing your own history and placing that in a tradition and being able to pass that on, and to be able to say, well, these are my experiences, which are based on a whole lineage. I'm going to perform them. I'll read them out loud. I'll write them down. And hopefully someone's going to be able to take part in a conversation about that evolving sense of identity.
Yes, thank you. And our ancestors did give us this range of music and orality and sharing of stories that we are coming into a consciousness of how we can utilize this within this dispensation that is still evolving, to have our voices heard, to insert our voices, and to make sure that we're heard. And the interesting step for me is, how are we sustaining this Black consciousness across the generations, our cross-generational kind of consciousness, and our accountability in doing this, and inserting this into the whole healing process of our different communities, spread as we are across this vast expanse of geography and time, and the inherent stress and tension that is part of that whole experience. So, Emily, how do you navigate this tension between honoring your ancestral traditions and challenging aspects of our heritage that may no longer serve us? Or is there any such thing, that there might be part of or aspects of our heritage that no longer serves us? How do we decide what to leave behind, what to take forward in our attempts to navigate this tension?
Yes, it's a really good question. And, because one that makes us think against the grain, doesn't it? And I like it, Marva, because I think sometimes, we can end up with in echo chambers where everybody agrees with one another. Sometimes we can find ourselves in those spaces. And I think that if we are disruptors, we need to even think about, how do we disrupt, our own versions of Black history and the own versions of our the narratives that we are told and we tell ourselves. I think one of the things that I've been challenging more so recently is a sort of myth around Africa that we find, and I think especially more popular now after Wakanda, and that's a very important myth, the idea that we were all descended from kings and queens. It's a way of saying that you should have pride in your Blackness and your ancestry, but we absolutely were not all descended from kings and queens. And I think that the celebration of empire, that one of the ways in which the sort of ancient African civilizations are raised to seem like on a par with European civilizations is by saying, look at all the thriving African empires that we had. I'm an anarchist and I'm an anti-royalist, and I don't think that celebrating empire, whether they're ancient African empires or British empires, is something that I would want to ascribe to. So I challenge the notion of celebrating empire, and I also challenge the notion of celebrating royalty. So not every person of African descent was descended from a king and a queen. And actually, why would we want to be? In many ways, kings and queens are people at the top of an unequal power hierarchy that should be dismantled. So that kind of mythology, I think that I feel more ready to challenge now. And I don't think, to challenge, and I don't think it necessarily serves us well. I think, we should be critical across the board. So that that is one aspect. And there's one thing I just wanted to add as well, after Andrew's really interesting point about the juxtaposition between the page and the performance. And I think that there's often been a tension between scribal and oral cultures in historiography that was always privileged the scribal, the written, over the oral. And but one of the things that I think is central to our Black consciousness and our celebration of Black consciousness is the way that writers are all Black writers, brown writers, are always bringing the oral into the scribal. And so we find so many innovative ways, and Andrew does that, in his own work, to bring voice and to bring orality onto the page. And whether that's like, Toni Morrison riffing with images like a jazz or blues novel, or just wordplay, the drawing from other languages without explanation. So just allowing the reader to immerse themselves in an oral culture, even though they don't have access to that oral culture anymore. And I think that that's sort of key to the survival of our Black consciousness as well.
And